It thinks
Mm,
in terms of categoricity. Cancel the other so that the one might live. But
mhm,
the world is much more promiscuous than cancellations, than getting rid of the capitalists. It's much more, it's much more fluid and relational. If you take down the king of France, the throne might remain. Slow down is not an invitation to do yoga more often. There are other temporalities in the room, and maybe our work is to learn alongside them, is to
mm.
meet these other temporalities, not the one of emergency alone.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Jessica Murray, Sierra Club Canada's Line 5 community organizer, and I'm part of a cross-border effort to protect our Great Lakes from a devastating oil spill. To learn more about Line 5, follow us at Sierra Club Ontario on Instagram and join the movement to safeguard the largest freshwater source on our planet. You can also connect with me every other week on Zoom, where I co host a 1 hour community building space and podcast club following the podcast We Are the Great Turning. Feel free to check out the episode with Sally Ludwig and the work that reconnects, and email ontario@sierraclub.ca for more information. But today, I'm speaking with Bayo Akomolafe, philosopher, writer, activist, poet, professor of psychology, and executive director of the Emergence Network. Now, if you've heard Bayo speak before, you might have experienced a similar feeling of wonder, mind expansion, timelessness, and confusion that I have. And while that soupy mix of feelings is anything but easy or simple, Bayo suggests it's perhaps exactly what happens when you find yourself in a crack, where a monster might soon appear. In this talk, we explore these ideas in the context of environmental activism. How do we think and what do we do in light of fuller awareness of the world we live in? His answers are anything but simple, and yet they bring a form of relief. And so before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. Hello and welcome to Bayo Akomolafe. I'm really, really excited to have a conversation with you today. I have to say that whenever I listen to you speak, I come out feeling like I don't know what my mind is. It's turned to mush. It's a piece of crystal. I'm not quite sure. And so, of course, I have lots of questions, and many people have lots of questions for you. But I wanted to start with a quote that I love from you. The times are urgent. Let us slow down. And what a beautiful chance I get to slow down with you just for a little bit,
Yes,
about an hour.
yes, yes.
To begin, I'm curious to know, where are you? How are you? How are we situating ourselves into this space together?
It's good to meet you, Jessica,
Too.
and thanks for inviting this conversation.
Mm,
I suppose that these past few days, months, weeks, I've been feeling a form of overwhelm,
mm,
exhaustion.
mhm,
Of course, there are personal dimensions to that, but on another scale, another dimension of intensity, it feels like it feels to me like this overwhelm is a prophet of things yet to come.
mm,
It's like to me, overwhelm is a collective sensing that we've exhausted the hospitality of a form of care,
mm,
right? It's
mhm,
like it's like we're feeling the choking because we've kind of grown outwards. We've and desire can no longer be contained within the the embrace of modernity. So it's this idea of overwhelm is not just personal.
Mhm.
There's a sense of deep exhaustion that is traveling through the land, and I sense that too.
Yeah, I sense that with you. I sense that with you on a very deep level. I think I know you have children, as do I, and I think that crystallizes that even more.
Mhm.
I definitely personally sometimes wake up with a whether it's panic or overwhelm, I can't really. I'm like, why? I'm like, well, of course, but there's not like a specific acute thing that's happening so much as like, and drawing from another thought that been exposed to from you is being not separate from our environments. Of course, we're feeling it. Of course, we're feeling it. And it was just last night, I was on the couch with my partner, and he we were debating whether or not humans would survive another 200 years or 7 generations. And oh, it's a big question, but yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh my God,
Mhm.
there's just so much going on in the world.
Mhm. There is so much going on in the world. That is one way to put it. When you're speaking about being on a couch, I immediately had this wild drama playing out in my head. I'm sorry, it happens all the time.
I love
It's not. It's only. It's the undercurrent of my everyday. I'm attentive. I'm listening. I'm here. I'm present.
it.
But there's also this other thing that continues to play out, instigated by what I'm listening to. So when you mentioned couch, my head immediately blasted into
Mhm.
uh, a Netflix series that hasn't been made yet
Oh.
and will probably never be made. But that's how it played out in my head now. And it was a client arriving for a therapy session
Mm.
and lying down on a couch just before the psychotherapist trained in Freudian psychodynamics nestles himself into his own chair next to the couch. And the client realizes and says it, I'm so sorry, the couch is small, right? and, and the series ends.
That's it.
Right, that's it. Like the couch, that just played out in my head. It just, I'm so sorry.
No.
It's small. And the therapist looks at the client and the client looks at and the cast. That's it. Credits. Roll the credits. Just,
Oh,
it
I love
rolls.
that. I really appreciate you sharing what emerges naturally from whatever I share. So that is very welcome. And naturally, I think that's arising out of some of your most recent work. I've seen that you're really looking at this concept of therapy and what it means as we shift into. Makes me kind of beg the question, like, where exactly are we? When does it mark a new space? When did that happen? But
Hmm.
anytime when you speak it, I know what you mean.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know? And that just speaks to the level of confusion that I experience, and I think many people experience on a daily basis. I want to circle us back in before we start, thinking through who we're going to cast for this Netflix series. And I do want to nestle us into the context of climate action, knowing that, of course, that climate work is anti-racism work. It's trans lives work. It's so many different movements that are coming into one place. And more people are talking about it, which is wonderful. I think more people are understanding the meaning of intersectionality, which is also wonderful. Before I kind of have more specific questions, I'm curious to know what comes up for you as I put us into that landscape.
Well, I'm investigating at the moment for my book. I just coined a term recently. The term is Curapoiesis. Cura. I wish I spelled it with a Q to be cooler, but Curapoiesis. Cura and poesis. Cura is Latin or Greek for care or curation, and poesis is becoming. So it's about how care becomes, how care is made. And my presupposition is that there isn't a stable ideal called care, not even justice.
Mm,
It's being made, it's punctuated, it's staccatoed, it's inebriated, it's partial, it's contingent, it is not just there, utopian and stable. It's not settled once and for all. It's like an organism constantly breaking apart, becoming carceral sometimes, but also becoming different, becoming monstrous. So when you ask about therapy, for instance, and what we're becoming, and thinking about these landscapes and how care is often modified, like anti-racism is a form of care.
Mm.
I'm asking about that couch that gets too small. I'm asking about what if the therapist's name in this all too brief Netflix series is Procrustes, the Greek robber who took, you know this Procrustes?
I don't.
No, the Greek highway robber killed
Mm.
by Theseus, but that's beside the point. He was a marauder. He would invite travelers on the road to his house just to for the night. That was hospitality in those times.
Mm.
Like it was the precursor to Airbnb. Like just you can just hang out here and then travel on your way in the morning. It was kind and nice, but in the middle of the night, while you were asleep on his bed, he would come with a measuring tape, and while you are yeah, it should be a Netflix series. And while you're right there on the bed, he would measure you out and measure the difference between you and the bed. If you exceeded the bed, if you were tall, for instance, and your feet just dangled at the end of the bed, he would cut you down so you fit in.
Jeez.
It would literally cut your arms, everything. You had to fit within the bed. And if you were shorter, smaller than the bed, it would attach a contraption to you, a mechanical contraption that stretched you out to fit the exact precise measurements of the bed. And I wonder sometimes, what if that bed is a couch, a therapist's couch? What if the therapist is Procrustes? What does
Mm.
care look like when it becomes precise,
Mm.
political, a violent inclusion into a type?
Mm.
What if what if the ways we, for instance, speak about anti-racism, what if anti-racism is increasingly becoming part of the white epistemologies it's trying to upend?
Mm.
What if care has to travel now? Those are my questions.
Mm. So, how does that look in the way that we care for our planet as well? Do you think that's like almost analogous as to how we,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. Absolutely. It's sometimes activism can become can well activism has never not been political,
Hmm.
right? It's not neutral, ahistorical, or ideal. It emerges from other kinds of relationalities, other complex socio-materialities, right? I imagine that a lot of contemporary responsibility is domiciled in institutions and institutionalized responsivities. I think about how protest, for instance, this is just one example out of a billion,
Mm.
how protest, for example, is increasingly state like. It looks a lot like the state,
How
like the
so?
nation state. How so? Imagine that we wanted to protest and someone said, and in order to do protest, we need to seek permissions.
Hmm.
And we're granted permissions. Protest here at this time,
Hmm.
on this date, on this day.
This size of bed.
Yes, the size of bed, the precision. And then we're in there. Now some people might say, well, there's forms of protest that exceed the bed, right?
Mm.
That do not fit within, that do not need permission, rather, that do not need permission from the state. But even then, some of the ways that we respond to crisis are the crisis gaining intelligence, repeating itself.
Hmm.
I've looked on with some compassion and deep empathy at younger folk who are angry with capitalist enterprises and institutions. So there was a time when it was rampant, when they would spray, either throw paint on a shop or something like that. some part of me was like championing and saying, yes. Another part of me was cautious because I realized that a lot of the anger and the fury that is materializing in those moments are amenable to productivization. They're available for categorical thinking. And what I mean to say is white modernity thinks in terms of categories. It's not nimble. It doesn't know how to craft sociality. It doesn't know how to travel. It doesn't know. It's very settlement like. It's very heavy. It thinks in terms of stable categories, us, the good guys, and the others on the other side, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the thing to do, whiteness might whisper in our ears, not just the ears of capitalist lords, but even the ears of those trying to take down the capitalist lords. It might whisper in our ears, say, try to get rid of them, cancel them, do everything you can to delete them. If you can
Mm-hmm.
delete them, the world will be a better place. But that's how whiteness repeats itself. It
Mm-hmm.
thinks in terms of categoricity. Cancel the other so that the one might live. But
Mm-hmm.
the world is much more promiscuous than cancellations, than getting rid of the capitalists. It's much more, it's much more fluid and relational. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is the reason why I think in terms of minor gestures, that if you lean on a wall long enough, you risk taking on attributes of that wall, right? If you
Mm-hmm.
push back on the wall long enough, you will begin to look like the wall. If you take down the king of France, the throne might remain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that institution will beckon on another body to fit within the throne. And that is historical. Napoleon took down the emperor and became the emperor, right? He became an emperor because the throne lingered. So
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about that. I wonder about the persistence of the couch.
I wonder about that as a lot as well too. And I know you've shared kind of ideas along the idea of part of why we need to slow down, part of why we pause, and this concept of gathering at the cracks. And I was reflecting on that metaphor, and I'm a potter, so there's times where inevitably these pieces that I cherish, there's a crack. And what happens when you put pressure on the crack? It breaks, right? And so quite literally, I'm like, where are the cracks? And how do we gather there? What does that look like? And
Mm,
I'm curious to know, and perhaps you have some answers in terms of some of your work with the Emergence Network and
mhm,
how you're gathering in that space, which sounds
mhm,
like because it's so planetary in scope, is perhaps more online. So I
mhm,
imagine you spend a lot of time online on screens.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Just trying to situate the question. What do cracks look like? Was that?
Yeah, like where? So, I mean, the deeper question for me is like, then, yes, we have been pushing so hard. We're becoming the wall. We think we're in a place of care and therapy, but really we're on this place that's really limiting us. So where do we find freedom? Like, where do we find true liberation into something different? Where do we find transformation when it's like you might be thinking you're outside the box and you're still inside the box?
I don't want to throw up some diva kind of response and say that I'm also suspicious of freedom, but let me go ahead and say this.
Mm.
That I was in Brazil recently filming a documentary called Three Black Men, and this was not quite recent, I think September last year. So not at all recent, a year ago. And because there were such huge festivities around our coming, it was me, Orland Bishop, Resma Menakem, and a whole village that was traveling with us.
Wow.
And the city opened its gates, priests and dances and food and ritual.
Mm.
While they were showing us and taking us through stuff, they invited me, of the three of us. It's the three black men. I'm the blackest of the three. Maybe that's why. But no, I don't think that's why. The priest identified me and asked me to take some offerings to a giant boulder in the middle of somewhere. It's a commemoration. It's marked. But the stories around that giant rock with a crack in between is that when the slaves were escaping, they escaped through that crack, as if
Mm.
like a rite of passage, a threshold. And another story is that one of the Yoruba gods, possibly the most powerful, Shango, lives in those cracks, just stays there, as if everybody, every single escaping fugitive was marked as they crossed that threshold, like, I got you, I got you, I got you, I got you, just like that. And I was thinking about it with one of the three of us, Orland Bishop specifically. And I remember saying to him, remarking about how freedom was dwelling on the other side of the crack, and how they were escaping to freedom. And Orland paused and thought for a while and said, you know what? I don't think they were escaping to freedom. I think freedom is still a vocation of the plantation because it's legible within the plantation. I think they were escaping to indeterminacy. That's a different matter.
Yeah.
Freedom feels so already there. It's potent, compelling, and feels like another form of settlement, almost in the ways that we talk about alternative this, alternative that. It's almost like we're looking for more space within the moral structures we already know. But they were not looking for space within moral structures they already knew. They were not going from here to there. There wasn't made yet. It wasn't like they had a GPS system saying turn left, turn right. You're 300 feet away from your destination. It's on your left. It was that it wasn't there yet. Their escaping was a form of care. It was still being made, hence the indeterminacy. So the cracks are creatures of indeterminacy. They're critters of indeterminacy. I don't think they're necessarily freeing in the terms of more freedom for y'all. Look under your seat. There's freedom there, freedom for you and freedom for me. Oprah Winfrey. It's. I don't think it's that. I think it's an invitation to experimentation. That care requires experimentation, and that's where cracks are. Cracks are, our edges. They are the ecotones of reality. It's the places where continuity becomes difficult, where something else is in the room, maybe registered or signaled or designated by grief or loss. Maybe it's it's a deterritorialization of the compelling stories we tell ourselves as modern citizens. It may show up in different ways, but it is not your crack and my crack. It's not like a trending thing, like, oh, you have your cracks, I have my personal cracks. They're not, like get a crack today or something, crack-a-lacking. It's nothing like that. It's a crack in experience, a biopolitics of experience. It's like a crack in an ecology that makes our personal experiences different.
The word
Something
that
like
comes up for me is disruption.
mm-hmm.
Kind of like a disruption from the status quo that kind of shakes you awake.
Mm-hmm.
Is that more along the lines?
Something like that. It's like scratching the troughs of experience so that a different kind of thing is noticeable in the room and available. It resources indeterminacy. That's what cracks do. And that's why whiteness polices cracks. Anything that looks like cracks, it polices it so we can get back to normalcy.
So anything that can't be categorized or
It
named.
resists category and it cannot be anticipated. Like people try to tell me, so what's the method here? What's the what's the method for implementing cracks? How do you implement cracks? Something about that question immediately shocks us out of the material world. It kind of situates us, positions us in some kind of floating place where we can look on the realm of material bliss and fury and determine how things go and then determine when we want to enter into it. Yeah, I don't think we can do that. Yeah.
Could you give me an example of a personal experience of a crack?
Okay. An example.
Yeah.
Experience of
Yeah.
cracks. Okay, let me preface what I'm about to say by also introducing the monster.
Mm-hmm.
That the monster to me is how cracks become visible within our structures. We can't see them, feel them, think them, except they show up as monsters. Of course, the monster, if you actually look at the etymology of the word monster, it's not something with heads, with the horns or something. The way we try to characterize the monster is comes from the word monstrum, the monstrum, which is to put to work.
Mm.
It's like that's why it's in demonstration. The monster is in demonstration. The monster is within.
Is that the same
So
word as demon?
no, no, no.
No,
Oh,
different.
who knows? Hey, I never actually considered that. I never actually considered maybe it's unlikely to be the case, but it might just be that maybe it has something to do. Maybe they're etymologically connected, distant cousins of some kind. So I theorize between monsters and the monstrous, right? The monstrous is how the world moves. It is erotic, it is desirous, it is processual. There's something about it that really cannot be put into words or put into language. It's just a roaming teenage awkward mess that we rudely call reality, right? Um, and often in its proliferation of itself, it kind of crystallizes and creates something that is so violently unfamiliar that
Mm.
we often rush to press it back down, like the pandemic, like build back better, get back to normal, something like that. Let's just get back to how we know things. I often use this chemical example of how crystals are made. Since you invoked crystals in the beginning, you can actually make crystals in a lab with a supersaturated solution. But to do it, it often takes thousands of years for crystals to form naturally. But to do it in a lab, you would need a seed crystal.
Mm.
And you would drop it in that supersaturated solution. And there are actually YouTube videos that show this. And immediately upon contact, something crystallizes and
Mm-hmm.
it just, the supersaturated liquid becomes hardened. It just becomes a crystal in that way,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think that's how monsters show up. They crystallize hidden tendencies in the room. I have an example in my head of how this showed up recently, but I cannot share all the details because it's deeply personal.
Okay, well, you share
Deeply
whatever
personal.
you're comfortable
But
with.
yeah, it reminded me that I'm not my own, that
Mm.
all my self narratives about myself, my sense of, even if not intentioned, but acculturated moral superiority, um, because I was raised in a Christian environment and there's certain ideals and notions of morality that I was raised in that carried on into my experience, even when I theorized the opposite. I
Mm.
was living with this, but I never really met it. And then I met it recently.
Mm.
It shocked me into knowing that I had always been part of this mycelial mess of things. Even though I never really said that, I struggle to even put it into words. But the way
Mm.
I'm thinking about it is I didn't even make a decision in the ways that liberal humanism might think of it, that you make a decision and something happens. It's
Mm-hmm.
that the decision was part of a web, and the web, the decision was diasporic. A little bit of it was here, a little bit of it was there, a little bit of it was there, and under the right conditions, it crystallized. That's the monster, and I'm walking alongside it now. Yeah.
I'm actually wondering whether I mean, just as you were speaking it, and I very much understand what you mean, because we are kind of a summation of all these different experiences, conditions,
Mhm.
different lives before us that also had their own conditions and their own experiences, and so on and so forth. And the image of the crystal just appearing, I'm like, wait, is that life? Is that me? Am
Mhm.
I the monster?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. I think we're monsters within monsters within monsters. We're tumbling down. These are this we're palimpsest, a monstrosity of palimpsests, text layered upon text, which makes it difficult to parse meaning or to tease out a sentence, a
Mm.
structure, a grammatical formation. It's difficult to do that when you consider how our bodies are ecological matterings, not even. I'm writing something around the thesis of free will and determinism. I'm not going to bore you with those concepts now, but a philosopher named Sapolsky, is famous for recently suggesting that we don't have free will. I'm not going to get into that now, but a lot of neuroreductionism is afoot these days. We kind of reduce everything to brain states and neuronal firings and the prefrontal cortex. I don't think we make decisions here. I
Mm.
don't think we're here. I think that, of course, the brain is involved as a node of coordination and intensity or intensification, but I don't think it is the source of decisions. I think decisions are distributed across our assemblages, right? Like Jessica is in a room right now deciding what you have for lunch, I'm not sure what time it is there, or dinner, isn't left to you as a supposedly composite, autonomous individual. It might be left to the TV behind you. A little bit of that information is in the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what it means to really take seriously that we are eco-psychological, we are eco-cognitive, instead of just visitors to the material world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I think about cracks. It's the promiscuous vocation of a world still in making itself.
It also brings up, because you did use the word mycelium, it
Yes.
also makes me think of how mushrooms just appear. And there's this huge
Mm-hmm.
subterranean world that we cannot even see. And even if you pulled it out of the ground, it would still be hard to see.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so immense that you can't really quantify it. It makes me think of that as well, too. I'd never really
Mm-hmm.
thought of the manifestation of physicality as the way that you explain it, as like a monster and
Yes.
a showing of something else.
Yes.
Yeah, so
Yes.
this is not the thing itself. It's actually there's
Yes.
a whole other world connected.
Yes. Yes. Oh, that is such a beautiful. It's yes. I mean, I know that that resonates so much because we live in India most of the time. That's our primary base. But here, looking outside, sometimes we just walk outside to this rolling field. We're on a mountain of some kind in Great Barrington. We just walk outside and a field of mushrooms have sprouted overnight. And we're like, this wasn't there before. We don't have such experiences back home in India. We live in a city and it can be very carceral. But here is very liberating. And to see mushrooms just emerge overnight and to realize that the mushroom is not itself. The
Mhm.
mushroom is the land sign
Yeah.
and exhaling and breathing.
Mm.
It's subterranean, but it is no less animist and animated than
Mhm.
anything else on the surface.
Hmm. How fascinating, no? It's like we think we can know a thing, but the thing that is actually the thing is actually almost inaccessible.
Mm-hmm. 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 Indeed. Indeed.
Mm. What in the
And
world does that mean for activism? What in the world we do to how we play a role, how we play
yeah.
a role in, I don't know. I don't even know if it's the right term to say turn this around, like, because it's like it's not like it necessarily. I don't even know if it's the right term. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think sometimes
Mm-hmm.
we think of healing the planet or whatever you want to coin it as like a returning back to. I don't know if I see that directionality as it like making all that much sense when I talk to
Good.
you.
Good. Good. I'm very pleased to hear that because I'm also um, quite reticent about suggesting that the cartographies, at least the ones that I'm interested in, lead to a returning to an original source. I don't think of temporality in that way. I don't think of time necessarily proceeding from the past to the future. So that in the ways that it's often, articulated, let's get back to the way things were.
Mm,
There's something deeply problematic about that. I don't think, for instance, that climate change is happening in time.
Mm.
I think climate change is making time in its happening. That's a different formulation. I'll
What?
say it again,
Yeah.
right?
I'm like, what?
that it isn't happening in time. To happen in time is to presuppose that time is resolved. It's just there. It's clock time, and this monstrous is moving within, like a bad guy or a villain in a game is walking through the game, right? It's in time. It's happening in time. I think instead that temporality is political, it is theological, and is constantly being made between bodies
Yeah.
that that we don't live within time. I mean, ask your organelles. They have different temporalities. Your
Right.
heart has a different temporality from your kidney. They work with different temporalities. The houseflies perform a different temporality, you know?
Mhm.
My attempt to might be
Yeah.
to
And
them, right?
yeah.
They're in different temporalities, not that they're faster, right? That would
Mhm.
only make sense within the spectrum of my own temporal experiences, but that they're, in a sense, atemporal, right? And that we are, we are paratemporal. We are always sidling each other. There are multiple temporalities at work. Climate chaos, with its inbuilt anxieties, with its notions of sustenance and sustainability, with the idea of adaptation and mitigatory responses, is a building of a temporality as a form of care. I just don't think that care is lasting like it once we think it might be. And this is your question about activism, right?
Mhm.
It's trying to build freedom within white epistemologies so
Mhm.
that climate is already a racialized analysis. My sense of things is that, and this is the reason why I formulated the concept of post activism, not to say we get beyond activism, but to suggest that we're already there and it's already around us. The invitation to slow down is not an invitation to do yoga more often. It's not an invitation to like some people I've seen so many memes, right? That someone said Bayo Akomolafe says that we should take time to get in all the data. That's not what I'm saying. That's not what slowing down means to me. I mean, and I'm trying to convey quite with some difficulty, I would say, the idea that there are other temporalities in the room, and maybe our work is to learn alongside them, is to
Mm.
meet these other temporalities, not the one of emergency alone, because I don't think that has any creativity left in itself, by
Mm.
itself. The temporality of emergency only actuates a singular whack-a-mole kind of response,
Mhm.
right? Just see a red button, hit it. It's very reactive. It
Mm.
doesn't know how to sit with nuance and complexity.
So we're rounding about close to the hour. I
Right.
want to leave our listeners with something a little bit more practical. So whether they're, so I guess you mean you could just pretend you're talking to me. So I don't know if you like giving advice, but let's say, let's
Here's the
say,
part I was waiting for. Advice.
let's say you're talking to somebody that is trying to build a movement. I mean, everything we've talked about kind of puts a big question mark on even that sentence. What can we be doing if we are finding ourselves caring deeply for the world, feeling deeply in terms of also the anguish and pain and rage and fear and panic and all of that? What is an intelligent response? I think like what do we do in community? What is the way forward? Or is it really part of it is really sitting with that mystery of not knowing and
Hmm.
holding that space and seeing what emerges?
Hmm. All of these and more, and then some.
Mm.
So, have you ever played with ants in your backyard? Maybe played God or something.
I want to
Like
pretend I didn't, be a
we
mean
all did. Let's
God,
just
but
give it up. Let's just own up to how evil we all are. Let's just.
mm,
I did,
like,
even
oh,
with the stomping and the magnifying glass and the light. I've done horrible things. I'm a murderer.
mm,
When I was younger, sometimes. I would notice an ant raid. This is them searching for food, moving in their pheromone trails. And I often took delight in separating one out of the pack. Like just, it's so Lovecraftian. But now that I think about it, and I gave no second thought to it, it was just something I did while we were living in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we had a backyard to do those kinds of things. I would just separate one out, and sometimes I would wonder, so what do you do? What now?
What you gonna do?
Well, yeah. What you gonna do? And it's probably snaking there, trying to sniff out the trail to rejoin its community. Maybe if I had my head on straight, and I don't think any of us do, but if I had my head on straight, I would suggest to the ants that it wasn't left to it. That something had happened to it that was beyond it. That by dint of hard work or persistence or labor or whatever, or spirit, it couldn't summarily find its way back. That something really serious had happened to it. Well, the same, it's the same thing I would say to, and it's a kind of situating of how really intense and vast and sprawling the question you've just asked is.
I tend to do that.
Because we're dealing with billions of years.
Yeah.
We're dealing with ecologies, animacies, vital subterranean worlds, a more than human planet that does not centralize, is critically incapable of centralizing one thing, right? I'm not saying hierarchies don't exist. I'm just trying to say even hierarchies are contingent upon flow and relationality, right? That brings me to this place of humility. And humility, of course, is coming down to earth from the word humus, or crashing down to earth and not arriving intact. It's that it might not be left to us. And even if I knew the answer to the question, what do I do now? I suspect it might be counterproductive to know. That even if we knew, it may not even produce the kind of things that we expect. If more data or more information did that, then ever since Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring in 1962, the fall of 1962, and all the books that have come out about environmental toxicity afterwards, if it were just left to data and information, maybe it would be in a different place. But it isn't. It's the same way someone addicted to psychoactive substances may have all the data, may know exactly what to do, and still you're caught up with something else.
That's so true. We might know what to do and we still can't do it. So
yes,
you really need to know.
yes, we might know what to do and still we cannot do it because it's not us doing the thing, it's the web in action. And this is not a way of dismissing accountability. It's a way of complicating it and stretching it. It's not a way of saying, it's all fatal. Anything that wants to happen happens. No, I know that we will most likely continue to engage in performances of care. We will attend anti-racist workshops. We will do yoga. We will swim. We will make phone calls, desperate phone calls to save people on phone sets that are resourced by the suffering of people in Congo. We will continue to live in complicated, contradictory worlds, none of us arriving. But something tells me that in the spaces of our falling together and our failure and intergenerational trauma and our wandering and our sniffing about for pheromonic trails and asking the question of what to do, something tells me that new forms of care will emerge from there. That the carcerality of white modernity is not itself by itself. It will give way to something else. And new forms of care will emerge from there. And they too will become carceral. And then new forms of care will emerge from that and maybe live side by carceral colonial forms of care in an unending, open-ended teenagely awkward, diasporic, promiscuous reality. And that's how I drop the mic or the comb, as it might be.
Well done. Well done. Thank you so much. It was a real delight to meet you and have this conversation. And
Same
I'm
here,
not
sister.
sure. I don't know. There's like a relief that I feel in hearing that. And then
Right.
also the anxiety is still there,
Of course.
they coexist together. And
Yes.
maybe that's
Yes.
just our enhanced capacity to hold that complexity, as you say, and
Yes.
still eke out a beautiful and meaningful life, whatever that looks like for each person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
That is beautiful.
Mm.
Beautiful.
Well, thanks so much again.
Hi everyone, Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, jumping in here to do the Q&A for today's episode. And before we get into the answer to today's question, I just want to say that our answers here are on behalf of ourselves and not on behalf of our guests. As you know, a little while ago we did an episode on the impacts of artificial intelligence in terms of the environment, not just in terms of misinformation, which we're seeing emerge as a massive issue. That's AI-generated content that is fake or misleading. We've seen this most recently around Hurricane Milton and some of the misinformation being spread about that. But as well, because of the power consumption requirements for a lot of this emerging AI infrastructure, which can be excessive beyond what is actually needed to perform digital tasks, and which seems to have a financial incentive behind it that is, again, beyond any sort of notion of progress or actual benefit to humanity. That's not to completely stand against all artificial intelligence or to say that there aren't virtues to it or that it isn't interesting from a scientific standpoint, but just to say that there are some significant environmental factors, particularly when it comes to electricity usage. So we had somebody write in suggesting some sort of limit to artificial intelligence growth, and I find that concept interesting. It does tie into what we talked about in that episode, and it's an interesting idea, and I think the way that you could make that work potentially is some sort of ratio of power usage, for instance, so that digital processes don't take up too much power that's needed for other essential things within society. Things like heat, things like light, things like refrigeration, things that we use electricity for. And the other limit, I guess I would put on that growth, and we talk about that a little bit in the episode on artificial intelligence, is that we want to make sure that whatever we're doing in terms of growing digital electricity need, that we can match it with renewable energy, that we're not having to put in place more fossil fuel infrastructure in order to try to match that increasing electricity demand, because there is, and we had an interesting episode as well about renewable energy and jobs in Canada, a thriving job market that could come out of data centers, for instance, in terms of renewable energy generation that we can build to actually power those centers. And there's benefits to the Canadian economy and Canadian jobs that could come out of that. And it's not to dismiss that, but to look at that at a rate that would be sustainable and that would be fulfilled by renewable energy, while we're also building enough renewable energy to fulfill the other needs of electricity that we have. And the other kind of AI limit you might consider is a limit on misinformation and its spread. And so that's going to be a lot harder to do. And we actually did touch on the concept that in some ways, one of the few ways to counter AI and misinformation might be with some sort of AI that actually actively looks for misinformation, and that in the history of communications, this is kind of the way things work. Somebody comes up with a new form of communications, it's pretty immediately used to spread some sort of misinformation. I mean, this goes back hundreds of years. And then somebody has to figure out how to use that same medium to actually counter the misinformation. And it's not an ideal process. It's certainly not a situation I wish we were in. I think there are some existential threats to AI-generated misinformation, if not the sort of existential threats that we normally think about, maybe when we hear the words AI. But we do need to come up with some way of dealing with that. And the idea of some sort of limit, for one thing, does help to keep down some of that overall processing power, at least for a time in which we can come to terms with this new technology that we're interfacing with. You hear sometimes interesting comparisons between the invention of artificial intelligence and the invention of the atom bomb, for instance. And there is an interesting parallel there in that in both cases, there was this thing that was capable of mass destruction, and I think, ironically, and this isn't the meaning sometimes behind that metaphor, but ironically, it would be human caused, because when we talk about AI's actual damaging influence on humanity, it would most likely be in the form of misinformation targeted for a purpose by human beings, not the AI itself attempting to wipe us out. And something else interesting we discussed in the episode was how an actual intelligent AI would really have very little reason to feel anything about us one way or the other, quite possibly. But what's interesting about that analogy, too, is that you will often hear people say, well, it's just technology and it's progress and it's the way things are going to be and we can't do anything to stop it. Well, if you want to look at the comparison to nuclear weapons and the pushback, societal pushback to the proliferation that happened, and the knowledge of them that on several occasions really diverted us from a nuclear conflict on a global scale, that was important. We almost did destroy ourselves because of a technological creation we had. And one of the few things that stopped that were, in some cases, moves to try to bring down the amount of nuclear weapons we had and the tensions around them by organized groups of people who were trying to do the right thing, but also in several cases, literally just individual people who kept their head on their shoulders and said, yeah, I don't think it's a good idea that we press that button. That's important. That's how social history impacts the role of technology in history, and vice versa. It's not as clear as we invent this new technology, therefore we have to let it run amok. We can actually put limits on new technologies, and it is probably best in the case of things that can do significant damage that we put limits on them. So it's an interesting concept, and I did want to raise it here as something worth discussing. And if you have more questions about that, please feel free to write into the Environment in Canada podcast. You can send your questions to info@sierraclub.ca. That's info@sierraclub.ca. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.